Kira had always loved watching the sunset from the edge of the crystalline cliffs. The purple sky would turn deeper shades of violet and blue as the twin moons began their ascent, casting strange shadows across the ancient rock formations that had stood for millions of years. She stood there now, her long silver hair moving gently in the warm evening breeze, her bare feet resting on stones that felt smooth from centuries of wind and rain. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft chirping of the evening creatures beginning their nightly songs. This was her favorite time of day, when the world felt peaceful and full of promise. Mora, her larger dragon companion, was draped across a nearby rock like a living emerald blanket. The dragon had scales that caught the fading sunlight and reflected it in beautiful patterns. Her wings folded neatly against her body, and her long tail curved gracefully around the stone surface. She had been Kira's companion since the elf woman was only 12 years old, rescued from a harsh winter storm when both were much younger. Now, after 15 years together, they shared a bond that went far deeper than simple friendship. They could feel each other's emotions, sense danger before it came, and move together as one unified force when danger threatened their world. Theron, the smaller male dragon, was more playful by nature. He had sapphire-colored scales that seemed to shine like polished gems, and he was always getting into some kind of mischief or trouble. Right now he was attempting to catch the reflection of the sunset in his claws, jumping and spinning in the air with pure joy and innocent delight. Kira laughed at his antics, feeling the warmth of their connection flow through her mind. She loved both dragons equally, but in different ways. Mora was wise and protective, always watching for danger. Theron was her joy and her laughter in dark times. Kira was the keeper of the charging station, a responsibility passed down through her family line for generations beyond counting. The station lay deep within the mountain, hidden beneath tons of rock and protected by ancient magical seals that only the keepers could open. This station powered the planetary defense shields that protected all of her people from the dangers of space. Dark forces existed in the galaxy, cruel empires that conquered peaceful worlds and enslaved their people. The shields kept these horrors away from her home and everyone she loved. Her father had been the keeper before her, and he had taught her everything about maintaining the systems and understanding the delicate balance of power that kept the shields functioning. He had died 5 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, and Kira had taken over his duties without hesitation. It was her honor and her responsibility, a role she took seriously every single day of her life. The evening felt different today, though, and Kira could not quite explain why. Mora suddenly lifted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as she stared up at the sky. Theron stopped his playful jumping and moved closer to Kira, pressing his small body against her leg. Both dragons sensed something, a disturbance in the force that connected them to the world around them. Kira felt it too now, a tingling sensation that started at the base of her spine and spread across her shoulders. Something was coming, something that would change everything forever. The sky above began to glow with an eerie red light that had nothing to do with the natural sunset. Kira's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. Ships were entering the atmosphere, large vessels descending through the clouds with obvious hostile intent. She had only read about attacks like this in the ancient texts, stories told of times long past when her people had faced invasion threats. She never truly believed it would happen in her lifetime, never really thought she would face such a terrible challenge. A low rumble came from Mora as the dragon sensed the danger. Theron pressed even closer to Kira, his fear mingling with hers through their connection. There was no time to feel scared or uncertain. There was only time to act. Kira closed her eyes for just a moment, centering herself and drawing courage from deep within her heart. She had been trained for this moment her entire life, even if she had never truly believed it would come. Without speaking, she communicated with her dragons through their mental bond. They understood instantly what needed to be done. Mora unfolded her massive wings and prepared for flight, while Theron scrambled up onto Kira's back, his claws digging gently into her shoulder. The elf woman ran toward the cliff edge and leaped into the air just as Mora swept beneath her with perfect timing. Kira grabbed hold of the larger dragon's neck and held tight as they launched into the sky, racing toward the mountain where the charging station waited deep below. The red glow in the sky grew brighter and more intense as the 3 massive starships descended lower. They were like moving mountains in the sky, blocky and brutal looking with sharp angles and weapon ports visible along their hulls. Kira recognized the symbols on their sides from her studies and her blood turned cold. These were Xanthar vessels, ships from the ruthless empire that conquered worlds and turned free people into slaves. The Xanthar had no mercy and no compassion. They took what they wanted through force and violence, leaving behind only destruction and suffering. The first energy weapons began firing, brilliant beams of destructive force that tore through the atmosphere and struck at the mountains. The ground shook violently as explosions bloomed across the landscape. Kira held tight to Mora as the dragon banked sharply, avoiding the worst of the incoming fire. Behind them, Theron cried out, a sound of fear and determination mixed together. The male dragon would not abandon them, would not flee to safety without his bonded companion. They reached the mountain entrance and dove toward the concealed opening that led to the underground caverns. The chamber doors were designed to open automatically when a keeper approached, but Kira waved her hand in the ancient pattern anyway, feeling the familiar tingle of magic responding to her bloodline. The massive stone doors slid open silently, revealing the darkness beyond. The dragons descended into the depths with powerful strokes of their wings, moving deeper into the mountain as the world above fell into chaos and destruction. The charging station hummed with power as they entered, its crystalline batteries glowing softly in the dim light. Kira dismounted from Mora and ran to the central console, her fingers flying across the interface with practiced ease despite her racing heart. The defensive shields were already active, but they were not at full strength. The Xanthar assault had somehow penetrated the outer layers, reaching the mountain itself. The power reserves were draining faster than they should be, which meant the weapons being used against them were more advanced and more powerful than anything in the historical records. Mora and Theron moved to stand beside her, their eyes glowing softly as they too connected their consciousness to the station systems. This was something Kira had learned to do over many years of practice, sharing her awareness with her dragons and using their combined mental power to enhance her control over the machinery. Together, the three of them could do things that no individual could accomplish alone. The charging station began to glow brighter as Kira channeled power through the system, trying to strengthen the shields and push back against the Xanthar weapons. But it was not enough. The reserves were still draining, the shields still weakening. She realized with sudden clarity that to truly protect her people, she would need to do something that carried terrible risk. She would need to use the forbidden technique, the one her father had warned her about. The method that required sacrificing her own life force to power the shields. She looked at Mora and Theron, seeing the understanding in their eyes. They knew what she was considering, and they were willing to follow her into whatever danger awaited. That knowledge filled her with both terrible sorrow and absolute determination. She placed her hands on the charging ports and prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that the next moments would decide the fate of everyone she loved. Kira took a deep breath and pressed her palms firmly against the glowing charging ports. The moment her skin made contact with the crystalline surface, she felt a surge of energy that threatened to overwhelm her completely. It was like touching lightning, like holding fire in her bare hands without burning. The sensation was beyond anything she had ever experienced before. A rush of pure power flowing through every fiber of her being. She wanted to pull away, to scream, to release the connection. But she held firm, drawing strength from the presence of Mora and Theron beside her. The dragons moved closer, pressing their scales against her sides. Mora's tail wrapped gently around her waist while Theron nuzzled against her shoulder. Through their bond, Kira could feel their love and their commitment. They would not let her face this alone. Whatever happened next would happen to all three of them together. The thought gave her courage and helped her push deeper into the connection with the charging station. Power flooded through the system now, raw and wild and barely contained within the crystalline batteries that lined the walls. The entire cavern began to glow with brilliant white light that grew brighter and brighter until it was almost painful to look at. Kira felt her own life force being drawn out, flowing like liquid fire through her body and into the machines around her. She could sense the energy being channeled upward through countless cables and conduits, racing toward the shield generators that protected the planet above. Above ground, the planetary shields were growing stronger by the second. The violet barrier that protected the world from space-based weapons became increasingly opaque and powerful. The Xanthar weapons struck against it in waves of violent energy, but each attack was repelled more forcefully than the last. The alien commanders must have realized that their assault was failing, that they were facing more resistance than their weapons could overcome. Kira's body trembled with the strain of channeling so much power. Her vision began to blur and her legs felt weak beneath her. She knew she was approaching the limit of what her physical form could endure, the point at which continuing would cause permanent damage to her body and mind. But the shields were not yet at full strength. They still needed more energy, more power flowing through the system to create the kind of barrier that would protect her people for the long term. Theron suddenly moved in front of her, pressing his small forehead against her hands that rested on the charging ports. The male dragon's eyes glowed brilliant white as he too began channeling his life force into the system. Mora did the same, her massive form rigid with effort as she poured everything she had into the connection. Kira felt the additional power flowing through the link, felt the dragons giving everything to protect their bonded companion and their world. The pain increased tenfold as 3 sources of life energy now fed the charging station. It felt like her body was being torn apart from the inside out, like fire was burning through her blood and muscles. Tears streamed down Kira's face as she fought to maintain her consciousness. She could not pass out now. If she lost awareness, the connection would break and everything they were sacrificing would have been for nothing. The cavern shook violently as massive explosions erupted from the mountain peak far above them. The Xanthar had realized their weapons could not penetrate the shields, and were now attempting to destroy the charging station directly by targeting the mountain itself. Chunks of rock fell from the ceiling, striking the ground and shattering into smaller pieces. Dust filled the air until it became hard to breathe. The ancient machinery around them rattled and groaned under the stress, but the protective seals held firm. Kira pushed harder, drawing even deeper into her reserves of power. She could feel the dragons doing the same beside her, their bodies becoming increasingly translucent as they sacrificed their very essence to protect their world. This was love in its most pure and honest form, the willingness to give everything without hesitation or expectation of reward. Then, with a brilliant surge of overwhelming power that lit up the entire mountain like a sun being born, the shields reached full activation. The planetary defense barrier became a brilliant violet dome that surrounded the entire world, visible even from space as an impenetrable wall of protective energy. Every Xanthar weapon that struck against it exploded in cascades of sparks and flame. The alien starships found themselves unable to maintain their assault, their weapons unable to overcome the barrier that now protected the planet completely. The 3 Xanthar vessels began to rise back toward space, their commanders realizing they could not win this fight. They had expected to face a weak and unprepared world ripe for conquest. Instead, they had encountered resistance beyond their comprehension. The ships fired their engines and began climbing rapidly through the atmosphere, clearly intending to escape to hyperspace and report their failure to their superiors. Kira released her hands from the charging ports and collapsed backward, her body completely drained and exhausted. Mora and Theron caught her as she fell, their massive forms cushioning her descent. All 3 of them lay there on the cavern floor, breathing hard and trembling with the aftermath of the connection. Kira could feel tears on her face and did not have the strength to wipe them away. She had done it. She had protected her people. They were safe now, but the relief was short-lived. As Kira began to recover slightly and catch her breath, she heard a strange sound from outside the mountain. It was different from the sound of the Xanthar weapons, softer but somehow more terrifying. It sounded like something was landing, like a smaller vessel was setting down on the mountain peak. Mora and Theron lifted their heads, their senses immediately alert and aware. Something new had happened, something unexpected and potentially dangerous. Kira forced herself to sit up, though her arms shook with the effort. She could sense a new presence approaching the mountain cavern, something alien but also something different from the brutal military presence of the Xanthar collective. This new arrival carried a different kind of energy, one that seemed almost peaceful in comparison but also filled with mystery and unknown intent. The dragons moved protectively in front of Kira as footsteps echoed down the stone corridor leading into the charging station. She tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming, tried to find the strength she would need for another conflict, but her body was simply too exhausted, too drained from the earlier expenditure of power. All she could do was wait and watch as the footsteps grew louder and closer. 2 figures emerged from the shadows of the corridor, silhouetted against the dim light of the charging station. They appeared to be humanoid, but with skin that reflected light in unusual ways. As they stepped further into the glowing cavern, Kira could see them more clearly. They were both identical in appearance, Male and female twins with silver skin and eyes that glowed faintly with intelligence and something else. They moved with graceful purpose, their hands visible and empty of weapons. They did not look like ordinary Xanthar soldiers. These beings seemed different, and Kira realized with sudden understanding that they were about to learn what they wanted. The female twin raised her hand slowly, a gesture that Kira immediately recognized as a sign of peace from cultures across many worlds. She spoke in a language that Kira did not understand at first, but then a small device on the alien's wrist began to emit a soft humming sound. Suddenly, the meaning of the words appeared in Kira's mind, translated directly from the alien language into thoughts she could comprehend. This was a universal translator, technology far more advanced than anything her people possessed. The female twin explained that her name was Lissa, and her brother beside her was called Kyan. They were members of a special division within the Xanthar command structure, scientists and researchers rather than military personnel. They had been monitoring the planetary defenses from orbit when Kira activated the shields, and they had detected something that no one in the Xanthar military had ever seen before. They had seen evidence of a civilization that would sacrifice everything to protect their home, that would use their own life force to power their defenses. This kind of courage and nobility was rare beyond measure in the galaxy. Kira wanted to respond, but her voice was too hoarse, too damaged from the strain of channeling so much power. She could only nod slightly to show that she was listening. Mora and Theron remained alert and protective, their eyes fixed on the two aliens, watching for any sign of deception or danger. The dragons had saved Kira's life many times in the past, and they were not about to let anything harm her now when she was at her weakest. Kyan, the male twin, stepped forward very slowly and carefully. He reached into a pocket on his garment and retrieved a small crystalline device that glowed with soft blue light. He placed it on the ground between himself and Kira, then stepped back several paces to give her space and to show he meant no harm. The device hummed softly and projected a holographic image into the air above it. The image showed scenes of conquest and destruction, worlds being invaded and enslaved, populations being forced into labor camps. It was a horror show of suffering and pain inflicted by the Xanthar collective across countless star systems. Lissa spoke again through the translator, explaining that she and her brother had grown tired of serving an empire that destroyed peaceful worlds. They had dedicated their careers to studying civilizations that showed promise for salvation rather than conquest. They had been searching for worlds where people possessed the kind of courage and selflessness that Kira had just demonstrated. They believed such worlds deserved protection and alliance rather than subjugation and slavery. The two aliens explained that they had stolen this small research vessel from the Xanthar fleet specifically to reach Kira's world and investigate what they had detected from orbit. They had left before the military conquest attempt failed, intending to come to the surface and make this contact alone without their superiors knowing. They wanted to offer an alliance between their people and Kira's kind, a way to protect both civilizations from the dangers that existed throughout the galaxy. Kira felt confusion warring with cautious hope inside her mind. She had been taught her entire life to fear and distrust outsiders, to view all aliens as potential threats, but there was something in the way these twins communicated. Something in their choice to leave their fleet and come down to the surface with open hands and peaceful intent. She wanted to believe them, but she was also afraid of making a terrible mistake that could endanger her people. Before Kira could decide how to respond, Mora moved forward and approached Lissa. The dragon sniffed the air around the alien female, her keen senses probing for any sign of hidden weapons or hostile intent. After several moments of careful investigation, Mora turned back to Kira and made a low rumbling sound, the same sound she made when she was satisfied that something was safe and trustworthy. Theron followed his larger companion's lead and approached Kyan, performing his own investigation of the male twin. The dragon's acceptance of the aliens seemed to matter more to Kira than any words could have. She had learned long ago to trust the instincts of her bonded companions more than her own sometimes uncertain judgment. If Mora and Theron believed these beings meant no harm, then she should consider the possibility that they were telling the truth. Kira managed to find her voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper that hardly sounded like her own. She asked Lissa and Kyan why they had taken such risk, why they would steal a vessel from their own people and risk execution for treason. The reward for failure in the Xanthar hierarchy was death, often a slow and painful one. These two were risking everything on the hope that what they had sensed from orbit was real, that this civilization truly possessed the qualities they were seeking. Lissa responded that they had spent their entire careers studying the patterns of courage and sacrifice across known space. In all their research, they had found only a handful of civilizations that possessed the kind of nobility required to survive and ultimately thrive. Most worlds either became slaves to the Xanthar or became conquerors themselves, slowly transforming into versions of the empire they once resisted. But some worlds, rare worlds, produced people who refused to compromise their values no matter what the cost. These were the worlds worth saving, the ones worth dedicating your life to protecting. Kyan added that they had already arranged for a sanctuary world where Kira's people could be relocated if necessary, a place beyond the reach of normal Xanthar exploration. There was a loose confederation of free worlds and peaceful civilizations scattered throughout the galaxy, places that had learned to hide from the Empire and to protect one another through mutual alliance and cooperation. This confederation had been searching for new members, new allies who shared their commitment to freedom and peace. Kira felt the weight of this choice pressing down on her shoulders. She was still exhausted from channeling so much power, still weak and vulnerable from the earlier connection with the charging station, but she was also the keeper of the defenses and the protector of her people. If she rejected this alliance, the Xanthar would simply return with more ships and more weapons until they finally conquered her world. If she accepted, she was opening her civilization to the wider galaxy in ways that might carry risks she could not yet foresee. She looked at Mora and Theron, seeing the calm acceptance in their eyes. The dragons did not fear what was coming next. They seemed to understand that sometimes the bravest choice was to trust in the goodness of others, even when that trust carried the risk of betrayal. Kira took a deep breath and extended her hand toward Lisa in the ancient gesture of peace that her people had used for thousands of years. The two aliens smiled, expressions of genuine joy and relief crossing their silver faces. Lissa reached out and clasped Kira's hand firmly but gently. In that moment, with two dragons bearing witness and two aliens standing beside her in solidarity, Kira forged a bond that would change everything for her world and everyone she loved. The war had ended not in victory, but in something far more precious, an alliance born from courage and mutual respect. The following days were filled with careful negotiation and cultural exchange between Kira and the two alien researchers. Lisa and Kyan proved to be patient and thoughtful teachers, explaining the structure of the Confederation of Free Worlds and how various civilizations worked together to protect one another from the predatory nature of the Xanthar Collective. They showed Kira detailed information about the routes that the Empire's military vessels typically use to navigate between star systems, the locations of their military bases, and the patterns of their conquest campaigns. Kira began to understand how vast the galaxy truly was and how small her own world appeared when viewed in the context of all the other civilizations that existed among the stars. Yet despite their small size and limited resources, her people had something precious and worth protecting. They had the capacity for courage and sacrifice that went beyond what most species could manage. This was their strength, not their weakness. Lissa and Kyan established a secure communication system that would connect Kira's charging station to the larger Confederation network. Through this system, she could send urgent messages to allied worlds if the Xanthar ever attempted another invasion. She could call for help and receive support from other civilizations that shared the commitment to freedom and peace. The isolation that had protected her people for countless generations was ending, replaced by a network of allies who would stand beside them in times of danger. But not everyone among Kira's people was comfortable with this new direction. The Council of Elders called for a formal gathering, wanting to discuss this sudden alliance with the aliens who had appeared during the attack. Some of the elder members feared that contact with outside civilizations would bring only danger and suffering. They argued that her people's strength had always come from separation and isolation, from avoiding the conflicts that ravaged other worlds. To join the Confederation was to accept the risks and sorrows of a larger galactic community. Kira stood before the council in the Great Hall, a vast chamber carved from living crystal that reflected and amplified sound, so that everyone could hear clearly. She explained everything she had learned from Lisa and Kyan, describing the Confederation of Free Worlds and the mutual protection agreements that bound them together. She spoke of the horrors she had seen in the holographic presentations, the worlds that had fallen to Xanthar conquest and the civilizations that had been reduced to slavery and suffering. She also spoke of her dragons and what they had taught her throughout her life. Mora and Theron had shown her that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection, from the bonds that tied individuals together in common cause and mutual protection. The dragons had taught her that love and loyalty were worth any sacrifice, that standing together as one force was far more powerful than any individual could ever be alone. This was the principle that should guide her people moving forward into this uncertain future. An old elf named Theodric rose to his feet and challenged Kira's position. He argued that her judgment had been clouded by exhaustion and trauma from the Xanthar attack. She could not be trusted to make such a momentous decision while still recovering from the wounds she had inflicted upon herself during the shield activation. He called for the council to reject the alliance and for the charging station to be sealed, cutting off all contact with the outside galaxy once more. But then Mora walked forward into the Great Hall, an unprecedented act that stunned the assembled elders into silence. The massive dragon had never entered the hall before in all recorded history. Mora approached Kira and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of support and solidarity that spoke louder than any words could. Theron followed his larger companion, the smaller dragon performing the same respectful gesture. The dragons had never been the kind to make public displays of emotion or political positions, yet they were doing exactly that now to support their bonded companion. The reaction of the gathered elders was immediate and profound. Many of them remembered stories of ancient times when dragons and elves had fought side by side against great dangers. They recalled legends of how the bond between dragon and rider had been the source of their civilization's greatest triumphs. To see this connection displayed so powerfully in the Great Hall stirred something deep within their collective memory and understanding. Theodric sat down slowly, his challenge effectively silenced by the appearance of the dragons. Other elders began to voice support for Kira's position, speaking of the need to adapt to changing circumstances and to find new ways to protect their people. The debate continued throughout the day, but the tide of opinion had turned. By sunset, the council voted to formally accept the alliance with the Confederation of Free Worlds. Over the following weeks, more members of the Confederation began arriving on Kira's world. They came in small diplomatic vessels, each one carrying representatives from different civilizations and species. There were humanoids who resembled humans but with slight variations in appearance. There were beings of pure energy contained within protective suits. There were insectoid creatures with multiple limbs and compound eyes. There were plant-based life forms that communicated through chemical emissions and subtle changes in coloration. Despite their vast differences, all of these beings shared common values of freedom and mutual respect. They shared a commitment to opposing the Xanthar Collective and to supporting worlds that fought for their independence. As Kira met with each delegation, she realized that her people's struggle was not unique or isolated. Countless civilizations had faced the same choice she now faced: the decision to stand alone or to join forces with others in pursuit of a shared vision of peace and freedom. Lisa and Kion helped facilitate these early diplomatic meetings, translating not just words but also cultural concepts and values that made cooperation possible between beings who had evolved on entirely different worlds under entirely different conditions. Their role as bridges between civilizations became increasingly important as the Confederation's presence on Kira's world grew stronger. Kira found herself becoming a leader, not just for her own people but for the growing community of allied worlds that were beginning to recognize her world as an important focal point for their resistance to Xanthar aggression. The charging station that had been built to protect only her planet was now being upgraded and expanded to serve as a communication hub for the entire Confederation network in this region of space. She thought often during this period about how her life had changed completely in just a few short weeks. She had transformed from being a solitary keeper of ancient systems into a political leader and diplomat for an entire coalition of free civilizations. She had gone from knowing only her small world to understanding the vast complexity of galactic politics and warfare. None of this had been in her plan. None of this had been what she had expected when she woke that morning so long ago and felt the strange vibration of Xanthar ships entering the atmosphere. But as she stood in the Great Hall one evening with Mora and Theron beside her, greeting yet another delegation of allied representatives, Kira realized that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Her dragons had known it all along. They had sensed the purpose that awaited her beyond the isolation of her mountain home. They had been ready to follow her into this new future because they understood her capacity for greatness and her ability to inspire others to believe in a better world. 6 months had passed since the Xanthar attack and the formation of the Alliance. Kira stood on the roof of the newly constructed communication tower that now crowned the mountain peak where her charging station lay hidden below. The view from here was even more spectacular than from the crystalline cliffs where she had stood that day so long ago, when everything changed. She could see the entire planet spread out before her. The vast purple expanse of her world now marked with new structures and new lights that represented the growing Confederation presence. Mora and Theron flew in slow circles around the tower, their wings catching the light of the dual moons as they performed their evening patrol. Even after so many months of increased activity on their world, the dragons maintained their protective routines, unable to completely shed the instincts that had guided them for centuries. Kira had come to appreciate this constant vigilance. It reminded her that freedom always required the willingness to defend it, that peace could only be maintained through strength and readiness. A message arrived through the Confederation network that morning that brought both hope and concern. The Xanthar Collective had been experiencing growing internal conflict. Several of their conquered worlds had begun coordinated resistance movements, inspired by news of Kira's world and its successful defense against invasion. The military structure of the Empire was beginning to fracture as they diverted more and more resources to suppressing these rebellions instead of pursuing new conquests. Lysa and Kyan brought her this news in person, having become close friends and regular visitors to Kira's world over the past months. They explained that the leadership of the Confederation was considering a bold strategy. Instead of simply defending against Xanthar aggression, they wanted to actively support the resistance movements on occupied worlds. They wanted to help these oppressed civilizations throw off the chains of slavery and achieve the same kind of freedom that Kira's people now possessed. Kira listened carefully to their proposal, understanding the enormity of what they were suggesting. This was not just defense anymore. This was the beginning of a war for galactic liberation, a conflict that could span generations and cost countless lives. But it was also the only way to ensure that her people and the other free worlds would ever truly be safe. As long as the Xanthar Empire existed, as long as it retained the power to conquer, the threat would always loom over civilization in this region of space. She conferred with Mora and Theron as she always did when facing major decisions. The dragons had grown even larger and more powerful over the past months, their scales now gleaming with an intensity that reflected their growing connection to the energy systems of the planet. They seemed to understand instinctively what Kira was considering, and they gave their approval through the bond they shared. These two creatures that had been her companions since childhood were now becoming something more. They were becoming symbols of their world's commitment to freedom and justice. The Council of Elders was called once more to discuss this new proposal. This time there was far less hesitation in the chamber. The Elders understood now that the Confederation offered protection and alliance, not domination or loss of independence. They understood that Kira's instincts had been correct all along. The vote was nearly unanimous in support of actively participating in the Confederation's campaign to support resistance movements throughout Xanthar-controlled space. Over the following months, training facilities were established on Kira's world. Resistance fighters from occupied worlds began arriving secretly, transported by Confederation ships through hidden routes that avoided normal Xanthar patrol patterns. These brave individuals represented the oppressed populations of a dozen worlds or more, people who had grown tired of slavery and who were willing to risk everything to achieve freedom. Kira worked with each delegation, listening to their stories and their dreams for liberation. She became especially close with a group of fighters who came from a world called Helton, one of the oldest and most technologically advanced of the Xanthar's conquered territories. Their leader was a woman named Victoria, who had fought a secret resistance campaign for more than 20 years, working in hidden bases and coordinating attacks against Xanthar infrastructure. Victoria was inspired by what she had learned about Kira and wanted to learn how the elf woman had managed to rally her people so effectively and so quickly. Kira and Victoria spent many hours discussing strategy and philosophy, sitting on the edge of the crystalline cliffs as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and blue. Victoria told stories of the long struggle against Xanthar occupation, of watching her people suffer under oppression, of the constant fear and the terrible choices that came with leading a resistance movement. But she also spoke of hope, of believing that one day her people would be free. Mora and Theron grew to love Victoria as well, sensing the warrior spirit that burned within her, despite her relatively small physical frame. The dragons would often position themselves near Victoria during training sessions, and the resistance leader found their presence oddly comforting. She began to understand why Kira valued the dragons so much more than just practical companions. They were teachers and counselors, sources of wisdom and moral guidance in the midst of the terrible business of war and preparation for conflict. As the resistance training intensified and more fighters arrived from worlds across Xanthar-controlled space, Kira realized that her world had become something unprecedented. It was a beacon of freedom in the darkness, a place where oppressed people could gather and prepare to fight for their liberation. The charging station that had been built to protect only her civilization was now serving as the heart of a movement that could potentially reshape the entire galactic power structure. One evening, as Kira stood alone on the tower watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about that day months ago, when she had faced the impossible choice of whether to sacrifice her own life force to power the shields. She realized now that she had not been saving just her people that day. She had been saving countless other worlds that were still struggling for freedom. She had been choosing to stand against tyranny and oppression with every fiber of her being. Mora landed on the tower beside her, the massive dragon settling comfortably, as if the stone structure was designed specifically for her rest. Theron perched on the opposite side, forming a triangle with Kira at the point where all three beings were connected. This was their sanctuary, the place where they had fought together and bled together, and where they had forged bonds that transcended species and biology and simple material existence. Kira reached out and touched the scales of both dragons, feeling the vibration of their life force flowing through them. She could sense their determination and their readiness for whatever trials lay ahead. The road ahead would be difficult and dangerous. Many beings would likely lose their lives in the struggle to come. But standing here with her dragons, surrounded by the growing community of resistance fighters and Confederation allies, Kira knew without any doubt that they would succeed. The Xanthar collective had ruled through fear and domination for so long that they had forgotten about the power of hope and unity and sacrifice. They had never encountered beings willing to give up everything for the sake of freedom. But Kira had shown them that such beings existed, and now that knowledge was spreading across occupied space like wildfire. Resistance movements were awakening on conquered worlds. Oppressed peoples were beginning to believe that liberation was possible. The age of Xanthar domination was beginning to crumble, not all at once but slowly and inexorably, piece by piece and world by world. As the first stars became visible in the night sky, Kira smiled and felt at peace. She had found her true purpose, her real calling in life. She was not just a keeper of ancient machines anymore. She was a symbol of hope for countless beings throughout the galaxy who yearned to be free. And with Mora and Theron beside her, with the support of the Confederation and the courage of resistance fighters throughout occupied space, she knew that nothing could stand against them. The future belonged to freedom.